The side corridor of the Ashford Grand smelled like white roses and spilled champagne. Ella Marsh had worked banquet service there for 3 months, long enough to recognize the laugh that drifted out of the ballroom as Connor Walsh's. Her ex, the man who had left her the month her dancing career ended for the woman whose family owned the hotel. Something in her locked up. She turned from the sound and moved for the exit and walked directly into someone, her tray tilted. A glass shattered on the marble. She looked up. The man was tall, broad, completely still, with dark eyes that held no irritation, only quiet. She gripped his sleeve without deciding to. "Please," she said. Her voice barely made a sound. "Just act like you love me." For 5 minutes, Marcus Day did not answer immediately. He was 39 years old, a structural engineer who had spent his entire career learning the discipline of not reacting to things before he understood them. He looked at her not the way men sometimes looked at women in distress, with that particular mix of pity and opportunity, but with the specific attention of someone who was genuinely thinking. He looked past her toward the ballroom entrance, where the sound of a string quartet drifted through the closed doors, and the laughter of people who had never had to fight for a room to welcome them. He looked back at her face, at the tears she was working very hard not to let fall, at the way her jaw was set, with a dignity that was costing her something enormous to maintain. He looked down at the broken glass on the marble floor between them, and back up at her eyes. Then he said, "All right, 5 minutes. Not a question, not a negotiation, just a quiet agreement." As if 5 minutes were nothing to spare, and he had decided she could have them. He straightened the cuff of his jacket where she had gripped it. He adjusted the single button at his collar. He looked at her one more time, with that same even attention, not asking, not explaining, not requiring anything from her. And then he placed one hand, broad and calloused and warm, very lightly at the small of her back, and he turned them both toward the ballroom, as though they had simply paused in the corridor for a moment and were now continuing on together, as people do. Ella exhaled carefully and matched her stride to his. She was aware of every inch of space between them, how steady he was, how utterly without agenda. She had been in the presence of men who offered help as a form of leverage, men who performed kindness like a debt they intended to collect. This was not that. She was not certain what it was. She had forgotten what it felt like when it wasn't that. They were halfway to the ballroom doors when a small figure came sprinting from the direction of the restrooms, sneakers squeaking on marble, a red ribbon loose from one braid. "Daddy, I washed my hands twice because the soap was the kind that smells like lemons, and I wanted to smell them more." The girl pulled up short when she saw Ella. She was 8 years old, with her father's eyes and a gap between her 2 front teeth, and the particular unself-consciousness of a child who has been loved thoroughly enough to have no fear of strangers. She looked at Ella with frank curiosity, and without any of the social machinery that adults spend years constructing around their real reactions. "Is she your friend, Daddy?" Marcus looked down at his daughter. Something moved through his face, careful and gentle and unmistakably real. "She is tonight," he said. He placed his free hand on the girl's shoulder. "This is Rue. Say hello." Rue looked at Ella for a long beat. "Hello? Are you sad? Your eyes look like you were almost crying." "Rue," Marcus said, with the patient firmness of a father who had learned not to apologize for his child's honesty. "It's okay," Ella said quickly, and was surprised to find she meant it. She looked at the girl. "I was almost crying, but I think I'm going to be okay." Rue considered this with the seriousness she appeared to give most things. "Daddy says crying is just feelings that got too full, that it's okay to let them out because they need somewhere to go." She paused and added a crayon mark on her knee for no apparent reason. "He cried during Moana." "I did not cry during Moana," Marcus said. "The grandma part, Daddy. When she's dancing and she sees Moana going out to the ocean, you definitely cried. That scene is cinematically designed to produce a physiological response. That's different from crying." Rue looked at Ella with the expression of someone sharing a private understanding. Ella managed to keep her face composed. "That's different from crying," she repeated, very seriously. Rue grinned the gap-toothed grin, and Ella laughed small, surprised, completely real. The first genuine laugh she had managed in weeks. Marcus glanced at her sideways, and for just a moment, the corner of his mouth moved in something that was clearly a smile, whatever he wanted to call it. They walked into the ballroom together. The room was ivory and gold, crystal and candlelight, tables and white linen, with centerpieces that probably cost more than Ella's monthly rent. Marcus walked through it without hesitation. He did not shrink or look for approval from the faces that turned toward them as they passed. He moved at his own pace, with Rue's hand in his, and his hand still at Ella's back, looking straight ahead with the ease of a man who had long since decided that a room's opinion of him was not his problem. She felt people notice them. She felt the slight recalibration, the second glances, the murmured asides, the way eyes moved from her face to Marcus's and back, with the specific calculation she recognized. She had grown up in rooms like this one. She knew the language. Marcus, she suspected, knew it too. He simply declined to speak it back. They found a table near the east wall. Marcus pulled out Ella's chair, the ordinary courtesy of someone raised to do it, and settled Rue beside her with a small packet of crayons from his jacket pocket. Connor Walsh appeared at the edge of their table like a weather system from the wrong direction. He looked at Ella with the expression she now understood she had once mistaken for affection, warm on the surface, cold underneath. His eyes traveled from her to Marcus and back. "Didn't know you'd moved on so fast, Ella." A pause, calculated for reach. Quite the upgrade. The words were quiet enough that only the nearby tables heard. But they did hear. Ella felt the shift conversation slowing, eyes orienting toward them. She felt the familiar collapse beginning inside her, the one Connor had always been able to trigger with a smile and plausible deniability in his pocket. Priya Walsh appeared behind her husband and touched his arm with the tone of a woman managing a man she had chosen to marry anyway. Her gaze moved to Marcus and stayed a moment too long, a swift assessment of the kind Ella recognized from years of moving through spaces where people decided quickly who belonged and who did not. Marcus pushed back his chair and stood. He pulled out the empty chair beside Ella. "Sit here, more comfortable." She moved. Then he turned to Connor, not quickly, not dramatically, just the way a man turns when he has decided to be clear about something. "She's doing just fine." Quiet words, completely even, landing like something set down rather than thrown. No invitation, just a fact, offered once. Connor opened his mouth, closed it. His smile recalibrated. He steered Priya away. The table around them exhaled. Rue looked up from her drawing. She studied the direction Connor had gone with the frank appraisal of a child who has no reason to pretend she didn't see what she saw. "Did that man make you sad?" she asked Ella. Ella was quiet for a moment. She was trying to put together an answer that was true, but not too heavy for a child to carry. "A little," she finally said. Rue nodded and returned to her drawing, adding a sun in the upper left corner. "Daddy says some people are mean because they're scared," she offered, conversationally. "They don't know how to be brave. So they make other people feel small instead. That way they don't have to feel small themselves." She considered her son and added a second, smaller one nearby. "He says, it doesn't mean they're bad. It means they're people who are having a hard time being brave, which is different." She paused, "But it's still not nice." Ella looked at the girl for a long moment. Then she looked at Marcus, who was watching his daughter with an expression she was not ready to try to name something enormous and patient, the particular look of a father watching his child say something he had said himself, and hoped, when he said it, might grow into exactly this. "Your daddy sounds smart," Ella said. "He's very smart. He knows how buildings stay up." Rue paused. "He cried during Moana, though." "Rue, the grandma part. Daddy, you said it's okay to cry. You literally said so." Marcus said nothing, which Rue appeared to accept as vindication. She added a horse with an improbable number of legs to her drawing, and showed it to no one in particular. The next time Connor passed their table, he had 2 older men with him, the kind of older that came with board seats and 20 years of shared dinners. He was telling some story with his hands, animated, performing, and as he passed he said something not loudly, but loudly enough, something about the guest list and venues being open to anyone these days, how things had changed. He did not look at their table when he said it. He was too practiced for that, but the remark was pointed in their direction, and the men beside him laughed, the laugh of people who understand a reference without needing it explained. Rue put down her crayon. She was 8 years old, and she had her father's stillness. And she looked up at Connor Walsh with the clear, direct gaze of a child who has not yet learned to look away from things that are wrong. "My daddy belongs anywhere he wants," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it was very clear. One of the older men turned and looked at Rue with an expression that moved through something complicated before settling into what might have been shame. Connor did not respond. He walked away without finishing his story. Marcus reached over and placed his hand briefly on top of his daughter's. He said nothing, but his hand stayed there for a moment, and Rue covered it with hers, and they were like that for a small, quiet beat until she went back to her drawing, and he looked up and found Ella watching, and she looked away. The wedding ended at some point, cake cut, toasts made, the quartet transitioning to something louder. Marcus found Ella near the exit and offered a ride home with no particular weight attached. Rue was already half asleep against his shoulder. Ella said yes before she finished deciding. His car was a dark blue sedan, clean but not new. The kind of car a careful person drives, because it does what it needs to do without requiring any performance. Rue was fully asleep before they left the parking garage, her cheek against her folded jacket, her ribbon finally loose. Ella sat in the passenger seat and watched the city move past the window. She told herself the silence was comfortable. After a while, she realized it actually was. They were almost to her street before she asked, "Why did you help me?" "You didn't have to." Marcus was quiet for a moment. The traffic light turned red, and he stopped and looked at the road in front of them. "Because I know what it feels like," he said, "to walk into a room and feel like you don't belong there, to have someone look at you and decide, before you've said a word, that you're wrong for the space." A pause. "I've been in a lot of rooms where people decided that about me." Ella didn't ask him to elaborate. She understood there was a story behind those words, long and specific, and not hers to ask for tonight. She held what he had offered with the same care she held the rest of the evening. There had been a time when Marcus Day's name appeared in the upper right corner of every drawing set for the Crestline Tower project, a major mixed-use development in Atlanta that was going to be his. 12 years he had worked toward it, from junior draftsman to lead structural engineer at Holloway Banks, one of the largest civil engineering firms in the Southeast. He had done the math, others said could not be done. He had solved the foundation problem that 2 senior engineers had declared unsolvable. He had earned the lead role in the way that people who are not simply given things earn them completely, without any room for argument. The project was assigned to someone else 3 weeks before groundbreaking. The reason given was experience. The person chosen had 6 fewer years at the firm and had never led a project half the size. No one said the actual reason out loud. They did not need to. Marcus understood the language. He had been understanding it his whole career, the particular grammar of rooms that smiled while they decided you would not be advancing today, the vocabulary of opportunity offered and quietly retracted, the way certain doors swung open for other people and required him to knock every single time. He left Holloway Banks 4 months after that. He started his own firm, small, precise, the kind of operation that did not take every job, but did every job right. He was rebuilding in the truest sense of the word. And then Adele died a car accident on I-20, rain and a driver who ran a red light. Rue was 6 years old. Marcus buried his wife on a Thursday, collected his daughter from his mother's house on Friday, and did not stop. He simply did not stop. Ella did not know any of this that night in the car. She only knew what his voice had carried when he said he understood the feeling of a room deciding you were wrong for it. She knew that kind of knowledge was not theoretical. "Thank you," she said when she got out. He nodded once. Rue murmured something in her sleep. Ella stood on the sidewalk and watched the sedan pull away, and she thought about what it meant that the only person who had stood beside her all evening was a stranger with nothing to gain from it. 3 weeks later, she was cutting through DeKalb Park on her way home from a shift when she heard the specific wobble of bicycle wheels, the held breath of a child refusing to give up. She slowed. Rue was on a small bicycle at the edge of the path, red helmet listing to one side, jaw set with determination that would have been amusing if it were not so fierce. The bicycle tipped. She went down on one knee. She did not cry. She bit her lower lip, pushed herself up, and looked at the bicycle like someone deciding whether to renegotiate her. Ella walked over before she made the conscious decision to do so. She crouched beside the girl and steadied the handlebars. Try breathing before you push off. Breathe in, let it out slow, then go. Your body tenses up when you hold your breath. Rue looked at her recognition, then the careful joy of a child deciding to trust new information. Ella, she said. From the party, Ella confirmed. Marcus was at the far end of the path. She saw him register her presence, a moment's stillness, a slight adjustment in how he held himself. He stayed where he was. He watched. Rue breathed in, breathed out slowly, pushed off. She wobbled, steadied, and then she was pedaling not gracefully, but continuously, which was the only thing that mattered at this stage of learning anything. She made it to the end of the path and circled back with the particular triumph of a child who has just proven something important about herself. Ella, she shouted. Did you see? Not Daddy. Ella. Marcus turned away for a moment and looked at something in the distance. When he turned back, his face was composed. But Ella had been watching, and she had seen what had been there for that one unguarded second, the enormous, barely contained thing that a man keeps carefully managed when he has been carrying everything alone for a long time, and she understood, with a quietness that spread through her chest, that she was looking at someone who had been doing so for longer than anyone should have to. She stayed at the park for another hour. Rue practiced turns. Marcus stood with Ella at the edge of the path, and they talked about the neighborhood. A good taco place 2 blocks east, whether parking enforcement in this part of the city was genuinely punitive or just consistently unfortunate. They talked about small things in the careful way of 2 people being honest with each other about what they can reach, while larger things waited at a respectful distance. It was the most comfortable Ella had felt in a conversation in longer than she could clearly remember. Marcus did not try to fill silences that did not need filling. He listened the way people listen when they are actually interested, rather than waiting for their turn. He laughed when she said something that genuinely struck him, with a short, low sound that was completely unguarded. She noticed these things. She filed them carefully in the part of herself that was not yet ready to look at them directly. That evening, he texted her a photograph of Rue's face at the moment she completed her first full circle on the bicycle. Pure, unguarded joy, mouth open wide, eyes bright with the particular light of a child who has just proven something important about herself. Ella looked at it for a long time before she replied. The photograph in Marcus's kitchen was set in a simple frame on the counter near the window, and Ella almost walked past it before something snagged at the edge of her vision and made her stop. She had been there to return a casserole dish, borrowed the week before they had fallen into a rhythm of small, practical exchanges that neither of them had named, the kind that builds itself while people are looking elsewhere. Marcus was checking something in his office. Rue was at school. Ella was alone in the kitchen for 2 minutes. The photograph was old. The color faded in that particular way of pictures from more than a decade ago. It showed a young woman in a leotard, arms extended, mid-turn, her golden hair escaping from a bun at the back of her head. Around her, in a loose circle, a group of children were clapping. The setting was a gymnasium with cracked tile floors and a bear attached to the wall with visible effort. The light was the flat, generous light of a donated space on a Saturday afternoon. Ella leaned closer. She was 22 years younger, but the woman in the photograph was unmistakably her. She remembered that gymnasium. She remembered those Saturday mornings, the floor always slightly cold, the children always slightly loud, the particular satisfaction of watching a child discover that their body could do something they had not believed it could. She had volunteered at the East Side Youth Center every week for 2 years, teaching basic movement to any child who showed up, until her ankle gave out, and her world rearranged itself around that absence. She had not known anyone took this picture. Marcus came back into the kitchen and saw her standing there. "This is me," she said. "I know," he said. "How do you have this?" He poured coffee into 2 mugs with the ease of someone who had already decided something and was now only deciding how to say it. "Rue found it at a garage sale last spring. She said the woman in it looked kind." He set a mug near Ella's hand. "I kept it because," he stopped. He walked to the cabinet by the window and reached to the back of the shelf and brought out a small paper bag. From it, he drew a pair of ballet slippers. Old, worn. The satin faded from pink to something close to ivory, the ribbons frayed at the ends. He set them on the counter between them. Ella recognized them immediately and completely, with a sensation that moved from her hands to her sternum, without stopping anywhere between. She had left those shoes at Eastside Youth Center the last day she could walk without a limp. She had not trusted herself to take them home and face what they represented about what was over. They were in the same box as the photo, Marcus said. Rue brought them home before I could say anything. She kept them in her nightstand for 6 months. He paused. She said, "They were magic shoes." "Those are mine," Ella said. "I know," Marcus said. "I knew when Rue found them." He looked at the shoes, then at her. "I was 11 years old when you came to Eastside. I don't remember your face exactly, it was a long time ago. And I didn't look at adults directly back then. But I remember a woman with light hair who showed us how to fall without hurting ourselves. She said falling was just part of the practice, that it didn't mean you were failing. It meant you were trying." He was quiet. "That stayed with me a long time." The kitchen was very still. "You were in the program," Ella said. "Saturday mornings." "Almost a year." He wrapped both hands around his mug. "I wasn't much for the dancing, but I came every week for the feeling that someone had chosen to show up for us, that we were worth the drive across town." Connor Walsh appeared at the Ashford Grand on a Tuesday in November with the particular purpose of a man who has decided to use what access he has. He moved through the lobby in his good coat and asked to speak with the banquet manager, with the authority of someone who knows that requesting the person in charge is itself a form of pressure. He expressed concern as a friend of the establishment. He said about an employee developing inappropriate relationships with guests. He mentioned a name. He offered no details that could be directly contradicted, only suggestions shaped carefully enough to imply more than they stated. He was gone before Ella arrived at the office. She stood in front of her shift manager and felt the familiar weight of a story, once spoken into the air of an authority's office, acquiring a gravity that the truth cannot immediately match. She saw in her manager's face the specific discomfort of someone who had been handed something they did not want and did not know how to put down cleanly. She answered every question. She was careful and clear, and she did not cry, though the effort cost her something she felt in the muscles of her jaw for the rest of the shift. She found out later that someone had also posted a photograph to an internal staff group taken without permission, showing Marcus standing beside his car waiting for her after a shift. The caption was 3 words, no names, nothing that could be directly called out, but the implication was blunt and entirely legible to anyone who cared to read it. She told Marcus about all of it in the parking lot of a grocery store that evening, while Rue was inside choosing cereal. She told him because she thought he deserved the truth of what had been done and by whom. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, with the particular stillness of a man who has learned to be very deliberate about where he puts his response to things that are designed to provoke. Then he looked at her with an expression that held no performance in it at all. "Do you want me to step back?" he asked. The question was clean and left her entirely free. There was no pressure in it, no hope or fear she could detect. It was a genuine question from a man who would honor whatever answer she gave, without argument, without attempting to alter the terms. She looked at him. She thought about Connor's face in the ballroom, the practiced cruelty in the easy smile. She thought about the shift manager's discomfort. She thought about the photograph taken without permission, and the 3-word caption, and all the rooms she had walked out of in her life because someone had decided she was wrong for the space, and how she had always made herself smaller rather than argue with that decision. She thought about what it had cost her. She thought about what it would cost her now if she let it happen again. "No," she said. Marcus nodded once. He did not ask her to be certain. He accepted the answer the way he accepted most things completely, without negotiation, and that was, she thought, one of the more trustworthy things she had seen a person do. Rue appeared at the entrance with her cereal and a look of fierce concentration, reading the nutrition label with the seriousness of someone told you should always know what you put in your body. She announced that this cereal was technically a dessert, disguised as a breakfast, which she felt the manufacturer should be required to disclose on the front panel. Marcus said she might have a future in consumer protection. Rue said she was going to be an engineer like her father, but would do the other thing on weekends. They drove to Marcus's apartment for dinner, and Marcus made rice and beans and chicken in the small, clean kitchen, and Ella sat at the table and felt, with a specificity she had not expected, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The volunteer records arrived 9 days after she requested them from her mother's house. She had almost not asked for them. She told herself she already knew enough, that the photograph and the shoes and what Marcus had said in the kitchen were enough of a picture. But she had asked anyway, because she had learned a long time ago that not knowing a thing you could know was just fear wearing a reasonable face. She sat at her kitchen table on a Sunday morning with the folder in front of her and went through the roster from the East Side Youth Center Saturday program, the one that ran from her second year of college through the spring of the following year. The list was alphabetical. She ran her finger down the D's. Daaye, Marcus, age 11. She sat with the paper in her hands for a long time. Outside, her neighbor's radio played something with a lot of saxophone. A bus went by on the street below. The refrigerator hummed. The world continued its ordinary way, indifferent to the fact that something was reorganizing itself inside her, some understanding of how things connect across time and distance, and the particular randomness of who shows up for whom. She had taught this boy. She had stood in that gymnasium on Saturday mornings and shown him how to fall and get back up, and apparently said something she meant enough to repeat, because she apparently always said it, that the falling was just part of the practice, and it did not mean failure. It meant you were trying. And something about that had stayed with him across more than 2 decades, and a career built against constant resistance, and a grief that would have stopped most people, and a daughter raised alone on the other side of all of it. She had said something small to an 11-year-old child in a borrowed gymnasium, and he had carried it into his whole life. The weight of that, the strange, improbable weight of a kindness she had not even known she was giving, sat on her chest like something that needed tending. She thought about the photograph on his kitchen counter, the ballet shoes in the paper bag, the blocky letters on the gymnasium wall, the way he had looked, standing in front of what he had drawn at 11 years old, when he thought the world had forgotten that boy entirely. She thought about what he had said in the corridor of the Ashford Grand, when she had gripped a stranger's sleeve and asked him to pretend. She had assumed, in the month since, that he had agreed because he was a decent man and decency has its own momentum. She was only now beginning to consider whether there had been something more specific in that agreement, whether the boy who had once needed someone to show up for him had recognized something in the woman who needed someone to stand beside her and had responded from a place much older than that evening. She picked up her phone. "Can I ask you something tomorrow?" His reply came in 4 seconds. Yeah. 1 word. But she slept. In the morning she called him and told him what she had found. She read him the name. She waited. "Yeah," he said. After a moment, his voice quiet. "I figured you might find that eventually." She asked if he remembered what he had thought of her back then. He was quiet long enough that she thought the call had dropped. Then, "I thought you were the first adult who didn't look at us like we were a problem to solve. You showed up every week. You didn't treat it like charity. You treated it like it was just where you wanted to be." Ella pressed her hand briefly over her mouth. "It was," she said, when she trusted her voice again. "It really was." He picked her up on a Saturday in late January. Rue was in the back seat with a thermos of hot chocolate and a library book about the migration patterns of monarch butterflies, in the particular state of contentment that was her natural condition when given something genuinely interesting to read. They drove across town to the east side, through neighborhoods that changed texture. As they went, commercial strips giving way to smaller streets, older buildings, the particular look of a part of a city built by people who did not have the luxury of style, only necessity. Ella had driven this route on Saturday mornings when she was 19. She had not realized until now how well she still knew it. The East Side Community Center was surrounded by scaffolding and organized construction noise. A private endowment had funded the restoration of several neighborhood centers that had fallen into disrepair, and this building, with its old bones and good structure, was among them. They went in through a side entrance that Marcus seemed to know A foreman nodded at him with the easy familiarity of people who had spoken more than once. The interior was partially finished new flooring in the lobby, raw drywall in some rooms, the smell of fresh paint and sawdust, and the clean particular smell of a building being made useful again for the first time in years. Marcus led them to the main gymnasium. The floor was new, the bare was new, the windows had been enlarged to bring in more light, but along one wall, a section of the original plaster had been preserved behind a protective coating, a long stretch of old wall covered from waist height to shoulder height in the layered drawings of years of children who had been given markers and a surface and permission to use it. Rue walked along the wall with the attention she gave everything she cared about. Ella walked beside her. They found it in the third section, near the corner. A stick figure with a triangle skirt and its arms raised, clearly meant to be dancing, blocky letters underneath. The letters of a child who was still learning to form them. Marcus, age 11. Rue let out a sound that was half shout and half something else entirely. "Daddy, that's you." She spun and pointed, and Marcus walked over with his hands in the pockets of his jacket, and he stood and looked at what he had drawn at 11 years old, on a wall he never expected anyone to preserve. And he did not say anything for a long time. He just stood. Ella stood beside him. She looked at the drawing, then at his face, which was doing the thing she had learned to read the composed surface, and the real thing underneath it, moving behind it like water under ice, present and patient and very large. She leaned her head lightly against his shoulder. He did not move away. After a moment, his hand came up and rested against the back of her hair, briefly, the way you touch something you are grateful to have. Neither of them spoke. They did not need to. 6 months later, the East Side Community Center reopened with a Saturday that felt nothing like an ending. The first class was taught by Ella Marsh to 11 children between the ages of 7 and 12, free of charge, in a gymnasium whose floor Marcus had quietly redesigned to accommodate dance, as well as sports hardwood on a floating subfloor, the bare at the right height, the windows fixed, so the afternoon light came in from the west, and not directly in anyone's eyes. He had thought about the details the way engineers think about details, practically and with care. He had not mentioned it to anyone except the project architect. Rue had told Ella. Marcus had not. He was in the chairs when the class ended, and Rue, who had appointed herself unofficial warm-up assistant, reported her contributions with the confidence of someone who considers being mostly correct sufficient. An email from Connor Walsh arrived a few weeks later. 3 paragraphs, carefully worded, the kind of apology that names the category of wrongdoing without descending into specifics. She read it once and closed it without replying, not because she was angry. She found, to her quiet surprise, that she was not particularly angry, but because there was nothing in it she needed. He did not occupy any space in her anymore. That was what she had not anticipated. Not whether she would forgive him, but that the question would simply cease to matter. Late on a Thursday afternoon in January, the winter sun came through the tall windows at the angle it only reached in that month, flat and golden, the kind of light that turns ordinary things into versions of themselves that seem worth keeping. Ella was at the bar with Rue, who had moved from observer to participant with the quiet inevitability of a child who had been watching something long enough to decide she belonged in it. Rue was working on first position with the seriousness she brought to everything she cared about, and with a willingness to be corrected that Ella had come to understand was specific to her, a quality that would serve her well in ballet and in most other things as well. Marcus was in the chairs. He had been looking at his phone when Ella glanced over, but the phone was in his lap now, and he was watching Rue with the expression she had come to think of as his real face, not the composed surface he wore in rooms that required managing, but the one underneath it, the one he showed when he had decided a moment was safe enough to feel in. He looked up and found her watching. She held his gaze for a beat. Then she turned back to Rue and said, "Shoulders down, find the space between your ears and your collar. There you go." And the afternoon continued, the light moving slowly across the gymnasium floor, everything in it exactly what it was. On the wall, near the entrance, Ella had hung the old ballet slippers, hers, the ones Rue had kept in her nightstand for 6 months, and called magic shoes. They hung from a small hook she had put there herself, the frayed ribbons falling straight. Below them, taped carefully to the wall in deliberate and slightly uneven letters, was a piece of paper that Rue had made one afternoon at the kitchen table and presented without ceremony, because Rue did most important things without ceremony. 2 words, she stayed. Neither of them had been looking for this. Neither of them had planned it or predicted it or understood what was happening until they were already in the middle of it, and the middle felt, unexpectedly, like home.